From my experience of adapting and administering assessments for students who are blind and have low vision, I would fully concur with Carmen Willings when she says in her article on educational assessments that the appropriateness of a test given to a student who is blind or visually impaired is dependent not only on the ability to adapt the test, but on the characteristics of the tests, and if the questions are dependent on a student's ability to reference or call upon visual information. She also says simply adapting a written test into a large print, braille, or audio format or a computer does not in itself make a test accessible. Whilst I think that has always been something that I have innately understood when it came to working with braille readers, it really came home to me when I was working with a child with low vision, working on the STAR reading test, which I have talked about in my artifacts. The STAR reading test is a test of word recognition, but it achieves this by putting a picture there for the child to identify and then finding the word which correctly matches that picture. However, when I used this with the child who has low vision, I realized that the line drawing pictures, even when they were increased in size to make them quite easily visible for him, didn't necessarily make sense to him. And it was only while I was administering the test, which I had enlarged, that I realized that the picture of the bird in this case didn't look very bird-like in its black and white form, and also probably wasn't something that this student had an opportunity to see up close a lot anyway. So I then started just telling him what the word was, which is interesting because I'd done the exact same test with a braille reader only a week or so before, and I'd read all the words aloud to her, the picture, the words that related to the picture. So all she had to do was find the braille word that matched the word I had said aloud. So I figured I was doing exactly the same thing really for the child with low vision. And that is something that I need to ensure that other people who are working with him and other students with low vision are also aware of, and that you can't just enlarge the text and have it as a fair test compared with other students in the class. So that brings me to the test that I did for the braille reader, which was actually a maths test. It was a test of fractions, and it involved pictures of fractions of various shapes divided into fractions, and also reading the fractions from the text. So I went through thinking very hard about what it was that was being tested here. It's not a reading test, and for a child who isn't a strong braille reader, I had to make sure that it was her maths knowledge and just her ability to read the fractions themselves and possibly some equations that was being tested, and not her ability to read the words surrounding them. So I only brailled the fractions or the pertinent numerical information after each number, but I read the full question. I didn't read anything that it wouldn't be fair for her to have read aloud when the other students were having to interpret this from reading it independently. When it came to the actual diagrams, that was tricky, and it took a long time to make the diagrams. Then when I had made them, I realized that it still wasn't particularly fair because it was hard to identify the areas that had been shaded. Well, not so much that they'd been shaded, but how many areas it was, because the shading felt very similar to the dividing line between the fractions. So I then ended up going back and clearing the areas pretty much and only leaving a very slight texture in them, but putting a cross inside each one. This meant that she could actually count the crosses and therefore identify the number of spaces that had crosses in them compared with the spaces that didn't have crosses in them. When I was administering this, I also realized that she needed to be able to follow a logical pattern to work out how many pieces were and were not shaded or crossed in this case. And that was okay when we had shapes that were what I would call chocolate blocks, where you had a number of squares or rectangles all attached in a regular pattern. But when you had a pattern that had a lot of triangles that came off at different angles, and in one case there was like a huge star that had lots of was made up of many triangles, it was almost impossible for her to count and work out which pieces she had counted and which pieces she hadn't. There may have been a way around this. Afterwards I thought about this and thought if she'd had like a little stack of blue tack balls, she could have stuck one of those in each space that she'd counted as she counted it, and then maybe gone back and made sure that they were all filled in. But this is not as straightforward as it is for a sighted child, and I think that realistically we can use pizza kind of shapes, pie shapes, or we can use chocolate block shapes with a braille reader, and hopefully the skills gained or the knowledge that they can share from those can be shared into other areas of learning, so they will know that what a fraction is and how it can apply to other shapes, but at least in this instance they can actually count the segments themselves. In the chapter entitled Comprehensive Assessment from Foundations of Education, 2nd edition, Volume 2, Instructional Strategies for Teaching Children and Youths with Visual Impairments, the author Tony Hines identifies a couple of guidelines for all formal tests to adhere to when they are being adapted for children who are blind or have low vision, and they are that necessary modifications do not significantly change the content of the test, and I believe that in both cases I ensured that the purpose of the test was maintained, and also that interpretation is cautious, relying on analysis of the student's performance rather than only examining the test scores. And I hope that the teachers who were the ones taking note of the marking, although I was the one who had technically marked the test, were able to understand that we weren't necessarily dealing with a completely level playing field. I have definitely learnt from my experiences in adapting and administering these two assessments, and I will use what I have learnt in the future as I go on to adapt further assessments for my students.